joining me now to break down what we've seen in markets at midday is Muhammed Wagley from Sasfin Wealth. Muhammed, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. So stocks pretty mixed with tariff uncertainty still unclear. Do you think markets might have over-exaggerated Wednesday's move? Because after we heard of the trade court blocking the tariffs, we saw markets really shooting up higher, and then at the end of the day we did start seeing a pullback.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Ntaling, always a pleasure to be on the show. And secondly, yeah, this was probably the big news from a global perspective this week. Wednesday, we saw a massive rally in the futures. And then obviously when markets had opened, we did see a bit of a pullback. And I've got to agree, I think it was a case of sort of over exuberance. I think, we've been through one Trump administration and now we're about halfway through the second one. And, it wouldn't have taken a clairvoyant to tell you that they were going to appeal this. And I think, if you look at the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration, it looks like, this is very likely to go to sort of the highest court over there. It's very likely to land up in the Supreme Court. And even, I think, even if we see sort of a negative outcome there, just in terms of the legality of these tariffs, I really do feel like, based on how much of a sticking point it is amongst his constituents and, based on all his rhetoric going into the elections, I think they'll just find a different way to sort of push through these tariffs. So by and large, this isn't anything that's been resolved. I imagine we'll be speaking about this, well into the year, potentially even next year. It really is the story of 2025 thus far. And, it's very material to markets, and I don't imagine that that's going to change anytime soon. So we've got to keep an eye out for this one, and it's going to be developing over the next few weeks.
And I was quite surprised by what equities did in terms of the rally, because yes, the ruling blocked reciprocal tariffs, but it didn't block the sectorial tariffs. So we'll see those tariffs on metals as well as tariffs on the auto sector.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I've got to agree with that. And, for the time being, the appeals court has said, that they can actually keep collecting those import taxes. So I don't really think anything has changed. And I do think it was a case of over exuberance. But I think given sort of the uncertainty and volatility that we're seeing around the tariffs just this year, I think that is really the case, from a market perspective, whenever we do get sort of any positive news. So I think we've also got to temper ourselves a little bit in that respect.
Another market mover is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, the PCE, print out later today. What are your expectations on that front, Mohammed? Many economists expect prices to remain steady. I don't know, it seems like, the risk to inflation brought on by the tariffs is not really coming through.
Yeah. No, so I think you really summed it up in a nutshell there. That's really what we're keeping an eye out for. Now, everybody knows that tariffs have the potential to be very inflationary, but, we're only a couple of months into this, and from that perspective, I think it could be a little bit, or it has been a bit soon to see that reflected in the data. What we've actually seen is a more robust US economy than was expected. I think today's numbers may have sort of given it just enough time where we could see a little bit of an impact there. That's really what everybody's going to be keeping an eye out for. As you mentioned, this is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. These guys are incredibly data driven, and if we see sort of a bit of negative movement there, I imagine Mr. Powell will have something to say on the back of that. So I think today's a big one. So let's see sort of where the data comes in. If inflation moves in the wrong direction, I imagine he'll have something to say just in relation to those tariffs. So let's see.
And sticking with inflation, but bringing it back home, it's those lower inflation prints that have prompted the SARB to cut rates. We saw a 25 basis point rate cut yesterday from Governor Kganyago and his team. It was also surprising to see that one member even voted for an aggressive rate cut of 50 basis points. Was this move expected? And considering that aggressive cut, does this shift your expectations for rate cuts moving forward into the year?
Well, they definitely sounded a lot more optimistic than I expected them to be, truth be told. I think I was quite sort of conservative with my expectation going into it and quite happy to see the 25 basis point cut. But I will say that that sentiment probably wasn't shared by market. I think most major banks expected the 25 basis points to come through. And as you correctly mentioned, inflation was really the topic of discussion. I think that gave them the ammunition to actually make the decision. As of April, we were sitting at 2.8%, which was well below that target range of between 3 and 6%. And, subsequent to that, a lot revolved around, changing sort of the inflation targeting. Where we currently are is that, we have the range, obviously the 3 to 6%, and they're looking, or rather considering, changing that to a fixed target of 3%, which obviously gives us a little bit more stability, a little bit more predictability going forward, just in terms of projections and things like that. And I imagine it looks a little bit better from the outside looking in. So perhaps that could be beneficial in terms of foreign investment and things like that. So broadly speaking, I felt that the tone was quite positive. I do think it does bode well for future rate cuts. I think, there's always this narrative that, the Fed haven't done it, so we're unlikely to do it. And I think, twice in a row now we've shown that we do have the capacity to do it. So kudos to Mr. Khanyago in the Reserve Bank there. I think, on behalf of anyone that, has any sort of loan repayment at the end of the month, this is going to help. It's not going to make the biggest difference, but it will help, and I think from an individual perspective, from a consumer perspective, it was good to see.
Let's move over to some company news. Just came out with annual results today, delivering a double-digit growth in earnings and really benefiting from tight cost management. But I see that the share price is down over 5%. What's going on? Did markets not like the numbers?
Yeah, interesting. Look, I think you summed it up really well earlier when you went through the numbers. From my perspective, I thought these were great numbers. Really, I've got to say there was a lot to like here. But the share did actually come off on the back of that. Look, I will note, though, they released a trading statement, I think, on Monday in relation to these results. And on the back of that, I think, they had actually beaten expectations quite substantially. And we had seen the share rally about 6.5%. As it opened today, the share was more or less flat. And I do think that, the negativity that we're seeing here isn't necessarily a case of, the results being poor. It's more a case of sort of letting the air out the balloon, from the movements that we did see on Monday, because really there was a lot to like here. You mentioned the dividend, you mentioned the operational efficiencies, you mentioned the new stores. Personally, I couldn't find too many faults in the results. So I do think it's just a case of, coming off high bases from the start of the week.
All right, let's hit pause on the conversation before we move on to your stock pick. Let's take a moment to touch on some counters that have been attracting interest from your industry peers.
My stock pick is Brookfield Corporation. They're a leading global alternative investment firm based in Canada. They focus on physical assets such as infrastructure, renewable energy, real estate, and private equity. They've got a fantastic long-term track record. Current valuation looks compelling compared to global markets.
So a company I really like that I've looked at quite in detail recently is called Axon Enterprises. It's a company that I think sort of firmly sits in the defense space, somewhat different to the likes of like a Boeing or any of these sort of hardware makers. So they play mostly in the sort of police space, largely in the US. And I think what is very interesting is some of the stuff they're building. So yes, they're making some of the hardware that these cops are using in the US. So a lot of policemen use body cameras nowadays. And it's gotten quite sophisticated in that space where the hardware that they're manufacturing is also helping the uptake of their software. So, for example, right, one of their big selling points is the police force, on average, an average policeman spends about 3 hours a day writing reports, or at least they do in the US. Now, they've developed a system where that body camera is watching the footage and listening to the audio, and they've implemented an AI system in their business that will automatically generate a police report. Obviously, the individual police officer needs to go and look and analyze and just adjust, but it's taking a lot of that time off their hands and effectively increasing the size of the police force. You have less officers sitting in the station writing reports and more officers on the street. So I think, that's a key aspect of the business that we really like.
So, Jordan, they're going with Axon Enterprises and your colleague Andrew picking Brookfield Corporation. What are your analysis on those counters?
Look, right off the bat, I'll say I really like both of these stocks, and I'll go ahead and put my cosign on both of them. But let's start with Axon. I think there's an interesting one, and Jordan, I believe Jordan didn't actually mention, the big claim to fame. Many people won't have heard of Axon, but you'll have heard of tasers, and tasers is really the big claim to fame when it comes to Axon. It's kind of like sort of the start of the business, and the word itself comes from the product that the company made. And I really like this company for all of the reasons that Jordan mentioned. It's one that I looked at quite closely last year, and I'm still kicking myself for not investing. You did see that chart over there. It's one I really like, and well up to Jordan for identifying this one. Really great company. And then speaking to my dear colleague Andrew's pick, Brookfield is also a really, really good company. I like that it gives you a different type of exposure. Lots of private equity exposure, infrastructure, sorts of things that you won't see in very tech-heavy portfolios, which I think often enough when you hear our sort of global stock picks, it's almost always that. I'm not going to be any different a little bit later. So I think from a diversity perspective, this is a really good one. From a valuation perspective, it looks quite feasible at this moment in time. So I really like both of these stock picks. Really well done to the gentleman there.
So you like both those counters, but not your stock pick. Where are you seeing opportunity this afternoon?
So I like the cybersecurity space in general. Now, if you look at sort of AI-driven cybersecurity, it's a relatively new space. You can imagine the technology is relatively new, but what we're seeing is only about 25 to 30% of generated AI projects are secure. So I think, given the growing nature of AI, cybersecurity is definitely going to become even more prevalent. We've seen that trend massively in the past years. It's only going to accelerate further. So from that perspective, the company that I'd picked today is probably the most diversified player in the space, and that's Palo Alto Networks. So look, from a valuation perspective, they may not be sort of as attractive as they have been in the past, but they give you sort of exposure to cybersecurity all across the whole cybersecurity framework. They've got exposure everywhere, and I think from that perspective, it makes sense just to have them. They're probably the biggest company in the space as well, and they've got a great track record of success. So yeah, Palo Alto Networks.
All right, Muhammad, thanks so much for your time and taking us through trade at midday. That was Muhammed Wagley from Sasfin Wealth.